Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
And I am Russell, and my pronouns are he and him.
In this episode, we'll discuss the third Sunday in Lent, which this year falls on March 7th.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
One content notification for this episode. In our deep dive, we talk a little bit about Christian antisemitism, and we also talk about pregnancy, birth, and abortion. Today, for our deep dive, we have our special guest, Russell Braman, who serves as a chaplain for Iowa Methodist Medical Center and Blank Children's Hospital in Des Moines, Iowa. He also enjoys teaching prayer book Hebrew to folks of all ages, and nerdily, he loves Harry Potter, The West Wing, and has been known to geek out on languages. Russell, we are excited to have you with us today.
Yes.
In particular, we're excited because our first reading is the Ten Commandments from the book of Exodus. And in different Christian denominations, we number the Ten Commandments a bit differently. So I'm curious what you can tell us about a Jewish approach both to numbering the Ten Commandments and to the Ten Commandments themselves.
I was looking into the numbering, and the honest truth is I don't know a whole lot about the numbering of it. In terms of the Jewish approach to the Ten Commandments, there are in total 613 commandments in the Torah, all of which are, at least in theory, valid. Many of them relate to the temple service, which we don't do anymore, seeing as the temple has been destroyed twice and we never really built it back. So a lot of them do different kinds of things, but commandments about how different holidays are observed, commandments about what you eat, what you wear, how you engage with other people. There are 613 of them, all of which are, teach us different things about how we live life.
So the 613 is a lot, even if some of them are not applicable currently. Is there a way that you differentiate? For a lot of Christians, the 10 Commandments are a big deal. Is that also true in Jewish traditions?
They are certainly the old school David Letterman top 10 list, for sure. But, there are all kinds of different, there are plenty of other commandments that are also important. The other thing to remember is one of the things that I have found confuses Christians when I talk to them about Judaism is Judaism as it exists in the Bible doesn't exist. Ever since the temple was destroyed, we have worked through a rabbinic Judaism system. So there are these genres of rabbinic literature, like the Talmud, like the Midrash, like other brands of Jewish literature, which is rabbinic asking of questions about what such and such a thing means. And so, for example, the laws of kashrut, keeping kosher, dietary laws. The Bible says, you shall not boil a calf in its mother's milk. The rabbis bounce around and says, you can't have a turkey sandwich with cheese on it. And so much of Jewish law today is rabbinic in origin. So what you see in those 613 commandments, some of them aren't effective because of the lack of a temple, and others have been expanded or contracted to, reflect how the rabbis viewed everything.
Interesting.
So, from what I understand, one of the differences between the many, many differences between the way the Jewish people teach the commandments and Christians do is that with the Jewish system, there's an expected a sense of priorities to the system, when it's okay to break one commandment in order to keep another, which one is more important, and under what circumstances. And Christians really don't bother doing any of that. But, for example, I understand that it's okay to break keeping the Sabbath in order to save a life.
Not only acceptable, but mandatory.
Right. And there's a variety of different options like that, but they get pretty well spelled out in the Talmud and the Midrash and so forth.
Absolutely.
Do you have any favorite examples?
I'm trying to think off the top of my head now. The death penalty is a good example. The Bible gives us a death penalty for any number of possible offenses, the Talmudic rabbis have basically made it impossible to execute anybody Jewishly. There was an episode of The West Wing where they talked about this. The one where Toby goes to synagogue. And so, like, basically, the Talmudic rabbis made it such that if you really want to execute somebody, somebody has to stop you before you do the thing that you get executed for, remind you that it's a capital offense, and you can be executed for it, and you'd still have to do it anyways. Absent even that warning, you cannot be executed for the crime. The rabbis were very uncomfortable with capital punishment and made it next to impossible to actually do it. But it exists as biblical law.
Yeah. I remember that episode of The West Wing. I loved that episode because it wrestles.
Oh, goodness.
The giggling starts early. I
I
like
was
it.
like, too unintentionally
I think I
perfect.
have to leave that one in.
Yeah.
You don't really get a choice on that one, Emily. Sorry.
Yeah. But it wrestles with the death penalty, with capital punishment, from so many different perspectives, right? We get it particularly as Toby goes to synagogue and hears the rabbi and has conversations, but also President Bartlett talks to his priest about it and has a conversation about it. And
Joey, the deaf Quaker, weighs in at one point.
yes. Yep. Yeah, Joey. I love Joey. She's like the best.
Marley Matlin.
Yes.
Yeah.
But my nerdy connection between the idea of understanding the priorities of different rules in order to understand, is there a situation where you need to break one in order to keep another? That reminds me of an episode of the original series of Star Trek, specifically the super weird Space Native Americans episode, also known as the Paradise Syndrome, in which Captain Kirk is temporarily stranded on a pre-warp society planet, and while he's there, a small child sort of almost drowns, and he saves the child's life with CPR, which technically speaking breaks the Prime Directive. The Prime Directive, for those who aren't Star Trek fans, is that you do not interfere in a pre-warp civilization when you are part of a civilization that has warp speed, that can do space travel. But he breaks it in order to save a child's life. He also breaks Prime Directive on a handful of other occasions in the series and the movies, and sometimes just because he seems to feel like it, but that's a separate topic. He's Kirk, he gets away with it, that's fine. But it seems like he was making a choice that feels familiar to what you were talking about with the prioritizing life over ritual needs or other requirements.
So when I did my chaplain residency, I try really hard not to work on Shabbat. When I was doing my residency, the way they worked our on-call structure, there was no way to avoid it. So I basically told myself, in that instance, I'm doing pekuach. I can make an argument that coming to the hospital is pekuach nefesh, saving a life. And so I'm comfortable doing that in the ways that becomes important. If you've ever read, are either of you guys Chaim Potok fans?
Oh,
yes.
It's a novel called The Chosen?
You should read it. It's the book that I go back to every couple of years. It's probably another one of my nerdy loves. We had to choose a modern American author for our big junior research paper, and he was mine. But in the sequel to The Chosen, which is called The Promise, there's a moment in the book where, so the two main characters are these two good friends, one of whom is a modern Orthodox yeshiva boy, and the other is the son of a Hasidic rabbi, who, not to spoil the ending of The Chosen for you, but when The Promise begins, he has given up following his father's footsteps into the rabbit, into the tzaddik, into being the holy leader of his community, and is studying psychology in grad school. And he's working with a young boy who has some serious psychological issues, and a serious incident happens on Saturday. And so he gets called into the hospital to go deal with it. And, the phone rings on Saturday, which the phone in their house never rings on Saturday. And so his father tells him, you need to answer it. You need to go, pekuach nefesh. He does. He calls a cab. He goes to the hospital. he deals with the situation. And it was a no-brainer, an absolutely no-brainer.
Yeah. I had growing up / in seminary, maybe, I had heard that the 10 Commandments, like the Jewish numbering system of the 10 Commandments, is that the first commandment is, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And then it goes into the like, yeah, okay. That's what I was trying to ask earlier, because I love that. Like, most Christian numbering of the 10 Commandments starts with,
I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods.
Right, we divide those two
yeah.
up. So what do you guys divide that we don't?
I love that. Well, some of us divide coveting. So we covet your neighbor's wife and covet your neighbor's stuff as separate things. Is one of
I
the
like
options.
to think of it as coveting people versus coveting stuff. Yeah. That's the Lutheran and Catholic version.
Yep.
And then the other Protestants version has you shall not keep idols as a separate one.
As a separate one. Yeah. Okay. Once I learned that, I love the idea of the 10 Commandments beginning not with a requirement of people, but of a statement of liberation, right? A reminder of the way that God has been a liberating force for
the
people.
most often repeated commandment out of the 613 is?
I am the Lord your God.
Also an excellent guess. Not the most repeated. Be kind to the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, for you were once strangers in the land of Egypt. The sense of not just redemption, or not just revelation and, being redeemed from slavery, but this idea that this experience, there is no excuse for you oppressing anybody, which I also love.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I don't pay as much attention to the commandments as other people, but it is simultaneously not surprising to me that be kind to the widow and the orphan is the most common, and the anti-Semitism in Christianity is strong. And so there's like the way that things in what we might call the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament are taught in a Christian context are very different than how they're taught in a Jewish context. For example, the 10 Commandments, and having them start with, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the house of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Or that the most common repetition in the commandments is to be kind to the widow and orphan because you also were enslaved in Egypt. And so I was thinking about this, and different things like that come up with a fair amount of frequency on our podcast. And so Kay and I frequently will do something to explain the problematic interpretations. Part of why I love that the 10 Commandments begins with liberation is because there's the anti-Semitic trope of, well, the Old Testament God and the New Testament God, and they're different gods, and one is vengeful and the other's compassionate. And it's well, actually, no. The God that we see in Hebrew scriptures is the God who keeps coming back to people and keeps liberating people. And if you want to read it that way, the God we see in the New Testament kills his son. There's a very different way that we can read it depending on the biases that we already have. So, recognizing that there are multiple branches of Judaism, I'm curious, what are a couple things that you wish that most Christians or most non-Jewish people knew about Judaism or about scripture or kind of about anything that would either make your life a lot easier to live in peace, or just something you wish people knew?
The biggest difference between Judaism and Christianity that Christians I have experienced don't get, and I'm trying to say that very carefully, is that Judaism and Christianity look at sin in very, very, very different ways. So in Christianity, you have this idea of the original sin that can only be dealt with through Jesus' grace and forgiveness. Everybody is born sinful. This personage of Jesus is required to save you from your sinful nature. Judaism looks at it in a completely different way. Judaism says we're all humans. We're all going to mess up. The word for sin in Hebrew is chet, which literally means like an arrow missing the mark. The idea of Yom Kippur is that it's a day that comes after a month and 10 days of us being encouraged to, apologize and forgive and do the work of, reinventing ourselves and fixing our mistakes and our errors. And so there's this sense that if you haven't sinned in some way, you haven't been fully human. And the important work is the forgiveness and the repentance and the teshuvah, or the returning from the bad choices you made. And so that principal difference also leads to questions about what's heaven about in the Jewish world, which it really isn't talked about that much, because Judaism looks much more at this world than it does at any world to come. Although the world to come is an important part of Jewish tradition, it's just not as important as the idea of heaven is in what I have experienced of Christianity, if any of that made any sense.
No, it totally did.
It really did.
What's fascinating is, like, as you're talking about the ways it is, like, Christianity has taken the Jewishness of Jesus and been like, nope, we're gonna, like, make this other Jesus who's not Jewish, even though he was Jewish. And I think that's that last piece that you said about, like, the focus less on heaven and more on the present. In the Gospels, Jesus is, especially I think in Luke, which is not what we're talking about today, but Jesus is talking about the reign of God and the kingdom of heaven and those sorts of things as present realities now. And his focus is on the people who are alive and in the community in the present. Not like Jesus doesn't talk about like some future time where some weird heaven will exist and there will be pearly gates and all. Like that's all Christianity has made that. That's Christian fan fiction of the last 2,000 years. There's a lot of Christian fan fiction, and not all of it is recognized as fan fiction. So I appreciate that reminder of both of Jesus' Jewishness and of the ways that Christianity in particular has like tried to pull Jesus out of that and away from that, which is harmful.
Yeah.
For our faith, but also for the relationship between Christianity and Judaism,
which has been fraught over time.
Makes it easier for Christians to be horrible people.
Oh yeah.
I'm curious if there's anything else that you, when you think about like the 10 Commandments or Judaism, that you want to share, that you were like thinking about as we were thinking about this episode.
Or the 613 commandments.
Or the 603 other ones.
We got a lot of commandments. I think I'm debating whether or not I actually want to talk about this. And feel free to wave me off. But, the Jewish views on choice and life and abortion are also very different from what the religious Christian right tends to preach. And there's this idea in Judaism that life begins at birth, life that we can defend. And so until a baby is born, the mother's life takes precedence. And any rabbi would tell you, maybe not any rabbi, but the vast majority of rabbis would tell you, if the mother's life is in danger, you absolutely need to deal with the pregnancy so that the mother's life can be saved. When the baby is born, then the baby's life takes priority and precedence. Different people would tell you that what constitutes an emergency would be different things, but that's another place where Judaism and Christianity vastly disagree, or at least liberal Judaism and Christianity vastly disagree.
Yeah. Well, I would say liberal Judaism and conservative Christianity, because I think progressive Christians are much more on the same page.
And I think it's another illustration of a way that life takes priority. Absolutely.
The idea of saving life is foundational in Judaism, that, life is to be preserved. And I think that we show that in a number of ways, not the least of which being, like we were talking about earlier with the Talmud and the death penalty. But, if you go back to the days of Soviet Jewry in the 1980s and all of these, attempts to rescue folks from the Soviet Union, the greatest curse in Judaism is may your memory be erased. And we reserve that for folks whose memory really ought to be erased.
Yeah. Which is also like the flip side of that, right? I remember when Justice Ginsburg died, and there was a slew of Christians using Christian terminology about her and how we use it. And then there was like very quick pushback to say, no, the appropriate terminology for Justice Ginsburg is may her memory be a blessing. Yeah. And that was this beautiful moment of like, yeah, like, and even that is such a contrast, right, between rest in peace or rest in power even, and may your memory be a blessing. The focus, right? Rest in peace is like, okay, now you've done the work, you get to go. Like, it's so individualized. Yeah, it's so individualized. And may your memory be a blessing is that it spreads farther, that the work and the remembering of who you are and what you did in your life and all of those things continues to have ripple effects beyond just the time in which
Ashkenazi Judaism. On that model, we name our kids after relatives who have died.
I had a chaplain friend when I was doing CPE, clinical pastoral education, the first unit. My CPE partner was an open Orthodox Jewish rabbi, and he had talked about it because I think he was Ashkenazi and his wife was
Sephardi or Mizrahi.
Something else. And so, like, yeah, I can't remember. I only met her like once or twice, I think. But they had a conversation about naming their kids and whether or not they were naming them after people who were alive or after people who were dead, and how they were picking the names. It's a
big difference.
It was kind of funny, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I am named after my uncle.
Someone?
So my Hebrew name is Reuven Shlomo, and so I'm named after my mom's brother, my Uncle Ray, who died before I was born, and it was important to my mom that her son be named after him. That's beautiful.
It's a beautiful way for you to then carry on the blessing.
And I think it's important. My nephew is named after so my sister and my grandfather, both my sister and my grandfathers are his Hebrew name. So, some very special men who, whose memory will live on. Not that either of them could ever be forgotten.
Yeah.
Our first reading for this episode is from Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 17. God gives the Ten Commandments to the Israelites at Mount Sinai.
So one of the themes that came up for me in this passage was a theme of boundaries. So thinking about one of the ways that the Ten Commandments were taught to us in seminary was part of why they are do nots is so that you know the boundaries within which you can the majority of them are do nots. So then you know the boundaries within which you can do not whatever, but like as long as you are not killing, stealing, making wrongful use of God's name, each of those pieces, as long as you're not doing those, the community can continue to grow and thrive
Coveting is a weird example of that, though. It's the only one that forbids you from thought.
Yeah. I didn't realize that. Well, and like that's a particular thought that is pretty insidious, right? Like if you're constantly wanting what another person has, or I feel like that one would be the most likely to lead.
Yes, but there's also a big difference between walking in a parking lot, seeing a Corvette, and like drooling for a brief second, and then launching a plan to steal it. Like those are two very different experiences.
Yeah.
And I suppose you can honor your parents with your actions even while dishonoring them with your thoughts, which is probably the only way I survived teenagerhood. So.
Also fair. Yeah, I was thinking about it, and I just had never thought about that, the difference between the thoughts and actions. Martin Luther, for whom both K's in my Christian tradition is named, had this whole thing on the Ten Commandments of reinterpreting them in ways that make it impossible to follow them. So it was thou shalt not kill, but if you even think mean thoughts about your neighbor, you're killing them, and which makes it impossible to not break the Ten Commandments. And I think that was part of his goal. But what I like about the commandments and what I like about that, setting up those boundaries, particularly the ones that are about action and choice, is that it creates space for community. in a very, very different way from the boundaries that get set up in like the Divergent book series or the Hunger Games, where it's like, we're putting this giant fence around your community to keep you safe. And what it really is to keep you in and controlled. And I think that's another of those, like, how are we interpreting the commandments? How are we interpreting boundaries? Are we saying any boundary is bad? Because that's not, when there's no boundaries, then it's so easy to abuse power. But also when the boundaries are so firm and enforced from not within the community, it also does that, where it's like harmful to people. These feel like the middle area where we're like deciding in relationship what it looks like.
It's almost like creating a discipline plan in a classroom. You need a sense of rule and safety for people to be comfortable to jump out and grow. Or if you prefer Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you need safety and before you can do anything else.
Mm-hmm. But as we jump into the passage, in verse 7, we hear, "You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the sovereign your God, for the sovereign will not acquit anyone who misuses their name." And that got me thinking about the tetragrammaton. I don't know what you all call it, I don't know if there is a different thing besides the proper name of God. But I was thinking about like the ways that we use God's name and like the many names that we have for God. And I think part of that, right, is in Jewish tradition, when writing God, it's like a G, a dash, and a D on like typing to avoid misusing God's name. Russell, the tetragrammaton, is there another thing that you call it? Because I don't imagine you actually call it the tetragrammaton. That feels more like a Christians decided that's what it was called. But I could be wrong.
I have heard it called the tetragrammaton. I don't know that we necessarily call it anything except to say that I don't know that anybody actually knows God's full and ineffable name anymore. I think it was lost when the Second Temple was destroyed because the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, would go into the Holy of Holies in the innermost sanctum of the temple and say God's full name on Yom Kippur every year as part of the ceremony. Like they'd literally tie a rope to his feet so that if something should happen and God forbid he die in there, nobody else has to go in and defile the Holy of Holies. They can just kind of pull him out and deal with the situation. But I've always heard it called the tetragrammaton.
Okay. I wasn't sure if it was one of those things that Christians.
It probably is. That doesn't make it any less. That doesn't make it any less right or wrong.
That's fair. Yeah, I really love like thinking about the different names of God, and particularly with like the combination of Hebrew letters that make up the tetragrammaton and the connections that people have made to like the becoming type verbs and the ways that God is becoming or active. But I also just really like the names of God, and that sometimes like God is
Hashem.
The name, like Hashem. Yeah, I love language, and I have a couple books, and one is kids books about, I think they're actually mostly written by Jewish authors and illustrated by Jewish illustrators, for sure the authors, but it's like, where does God live? What is God's name? And it like has all of these different names for God. And then I think the ultimate one that they do is like one. God is one or something.
When we reach verse 16, we hear, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor." So I don't know about you guys, but I was a fairly serious and philosophical/religious-minded teen, and therefore got into a lot of conversations about under what circumstances is it okay to lie, and other, engrossing topics like that. And the thing is, of course, that this commandment isn't really about lying. It's not just lying. It's not about telling little white lies about whether or not that shirt looks good on your mom. Love you, Mom. But it's a bit more nuanced. It's more like don't commit perjury about your neighbor in a trial. And committing perjury takes lying up a level of seriousness, and lying about someone is, generally speaking, way more likely to cause trouble and suffering in a bunch of lives than lying to a single person. So all of those arguments you may or may not have had about whether or not it's okay to lie to an axe murderer about where the person they're looking for is. Maybe not so much about this particular commandment.
I think it goes back right to what Russell was saying about preserving life.
Yes, exactly. That too. There is a classic example of someone committing perjury. Actually, I believe he not only committed perjury, but arranged for a few other cases of people committing perjury. In The Count of Monte Cristo, which is a favorite of mine because I think it was one of the first classic novels I managed to read in the original version rather than the kiddie version. And there is a guy who is after Edmund's girlfriend, and so he gets Edmund wrongfully convicted and sent to a terrible prison so that he can coerce her into marriage, and that doesn't end well. Not to spoil the ending, but...
Doesn't end well for him, or doesn't end well for her?
Actually, just doesn't really end well for pretty much anyone. Yeah, that whole thing, like, everybody was unhappy by the end of it. And depending on whether you're watching the movie, well, one of the many versions of the movie, or reading the book.
Or the Wishbone. I think they made a Wishbone episode of this.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure there was. But I was really disappointed when reading the book because I had seen the movie by then. And there was a movie that came out in the early 2000s. I don't remember exactly what year, but they did a really nice job of adapting it. And in the movie, Edmund and his girlfriend finally wind up together at the end, and it's a lovely, happy ending. In the book, the girlfriend is, too old to be interesting by that point, and therefore she winds up living alone, and he winds up wandering off with this young woman who has basically been a maid to him, and that's, not horrifying. So,
our second reading for this episode is 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. Paul talks about the way God works doesn't make sense according to the usual human standards, but we find strength in Christ crucified. So one of the themes that comes up in this is foolishness, right? That the cross is foolishness. And I was reminded by River, who was on our podcast in Epiphany, of the episode of Doctor Who that's called The Year That Wasn't, where the master takes over the entire year and is doing all of these things, and it all ends up being foolishness because ultimately the doctor who had been captured gets free and fixes and stops the master and then fixes everything, and the world literally spins backwards to erase the year to go back in time a year. And so it becomes all of that horrible stuff that the master did ends up becoming foolishness because that whole year then wasn't.
And that is totally how physics works.
Yes, exactly.
That's not foolish at all.
I mean, it worked for The Flash.
And multiple other comic books.
Just saying.
I think Superman did that at least once.
Yeah, that's what River said too.
When we reach verse 18, we hear, "For the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God." And I like to use this verse as a reminder that just because something is silly doesn't mean it can't be useful or be helpful at some point. For example, Peter Quill managed to save the day with a dance-off, and an a cappella dance-off at that, in one of the Guardians of the Galaxy movies.
I forgot
So
about
you never
that.
know when foolishness may come in handy.
I'm a fan of foolishness. That's why we have lots of puns on this show, right? Rustling up a good one.
Oh.
You know what they say about the punster? They should be
Anyway.
drawn and quoted.
Excellent.
Yes, I approve. Continuing our foolishness, in verse 23, Paul writes, "But we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles." And I was thinking about the proclamations we make. So it's 1 Corinthians and all of the epistles that Paul writes also need to be taken into context. And we sometimes talk about this, but just like Jesus was in fact Jewish, Paul was in fact Jewish and also hung out with the Gentiles. And so he threads this line of belonging, and he talks about it, I think in Lent 5 we read about it. He talks about it in another spot in Lent. But this idea of this new religion, right? The followers of the way who become Christians don't make sense to any of the other ways that the world was working, that it's a whole different way that doesn't make sense, because crucifying somebody doesn't make sense as a thing that we would want to lift up, especially while the early church was still being persecuted. But it reminded me of Hagrid when he, at the end of book 7 of Harry Potter, when he proclaims Harry Potter as dead, that there's this sense that, I mean, Harry's not actually dead, but as they're coming out of the Forbidden Forest, he says that he's dead, and everybody is like struck, and there's the different ways that different people respond to it, right? There's disbelief, there's a commitment to keep fighting, there's triumph, but yeah, that was the proclamation that came to mind for.
And coming out of the idea of foolishness, the Jewish holiday coming up in a couple of weeks from today, which will not be a couple of weeks from when this podcast comes out, I would imagine, is the holiday of Purim.
Yeah.
Yes.
February 26th is Purim.
Okay, so we would have
sundown
just missed it by like a week.
Sundown the 26th. So this holiday that will have just passed when this podcast comes out celebrates the story of the Book of Esther. And because of the way that Haman is hung on the gallows he built to hang Mordecai in punishment for trying to kill all the Jews in Persia, it's this amazing holiday that kind of I'm using more Hebrew in this than I assumed I would. This idea of venahafohu, like that things get turned upside down and turned around. And so, because of that, it's kind of a combination of Carnival and Boxing Day where, people dress up in costumes. There's a commandment to consume alcohol in a way that you can't tell the difference between blessed be Mordecai and cursed be Haman. And it's this kind of amazing holiday that, celebrates foolishness. It's like a school that allows a senior prank. If you ritualize the foolishness, you can control it. But it also still serves as a steam valve.
Yeah. I remember breaks in seminary. There was one year that they didn't do a reading week, and they just had Thanksgiving break, and that did not go well because people needed a steam valve a bit earlier in seminary than that. I've never actually been to Purim.
I would invite you, except that it's going to be on Zoom.
But there was I figured it probably was going to be on Zoom this year, because last year
Purim was the last time I was in my
synagogue
until before
at least in Iowa. Yeah, but it is this I love the ways that I've read about and read in literature about it. The Trial of God, that's what it was. That's where I read about it one time. The book play.
I've heard of it. I can't remember the author.
I believe that this is also one of those holidays that has its own specific dessert.
I mean, Hamantashen
I'm always
are
a big
the
fan of those.
Ashkenazi tradition, yeah. But definitely very tasty.
I don't think I've ever had any.
In Yiddish, they're Hamantashen, Haman's hat. In Hebrew, they're Oznei Haman, Haman's ears.
Okay, I had not heard the second one.
That
fantastic. Is a little more interesting. Okay.
Haman's hat and Haman's ears. Perfect. The Trial of God by Elie Wiesel.
How would it not be by Elie Wiesel?
I thought it was by him, but I wasn't sure. Yeah, but that has, within it, Purim is celebrated, and there's, it's about there's pogrom and a lot of, really difficult stuff, as you can imagine, because it's called The Trial of God. But it's a really good, I really appreciated the play.
Our third reading for this episode is from John chapter 2, verses 13 through 22. At the start of his ministry in John, and upset that the merchants and money changers were turning the temple into a marketplace, Jesus flips their tables.
So one of the themes in this passage.
Although, to be fair, this is also a theme in this podcast. We bring it up regularly.
It's true. Especially the connection that I make. So one of the themes is economic exploitation, right? The idea, at least as I have been taught, is that the money changers and the merchants were kind of using the temple to make money, And there's a sense of, right, like people who are coming from afar for a sacrifice needed to have something that was unblemished, and the best way to do that was to just come to the temple and then buy the unblemished animal, instead of trying to like bring it with them and having the animal potentially like break a leg or something on the journey. And that is a good thing, like to provide animals for people, but it had evolved into a place where people were being exploited, who were being charged a lot or changing money from the money of the Roman Empire. And so it was becoming more of economic exploitation versus like a service for the community. So the most obvious example to me of economic exploitation is, in fact, the Hunger Games, where literally all of the districts are economically exploited for the sake of the capital's luxuriousness and excessiveness, to the point that like people in the capital at the party after the first Hunger Games, but at the end of the first Hunger Games book, people at the capital are like eating all this food and then like go puke so that they can eat more, while there are people who are starving in the districts. And economic exploitation, bad.
Actually, I'm pretty sure that they stole the partying until you puke and then partying more bit from the Roman Empire. That was definitely a thing that happened.
I am not surprised. They did talk about Panem at Circenses.
It's also interesting, going back to the life conversation, they're literally killing children, or having children kill themselves.
Yep, and each other. And yeah.
I've taught the Hunger Games in Jewish high schools, teaching Jewish values in the Hunger Games, or the lack thereof.
Yeah, there's actually a book on the Hunger Games written by a bunch of young adult authors. It's not specifically connected to Judaism, but it's different takes on the Hunger Games. So each young adult author has like a chapter. And so one talks about hunger and poverty, one talks about like reality TV, and like just the different, it's really interesting. There's a lot that you can do with the Hunger Games.
The other book that comes to mind is The Giver,
as a study,
by Lois Lowry, in the sense that, I should have said this earlier, but going back to the bit where we were talking about control, that's the whole idea behind The Giver, is that, you control everything, and then when you give somebody more information, they suddenly have power. Because what's the kid's name? Jonas? When he starts training to be the new giver,
yes,
suddenly he sees all the things he didn't see before, and all the things that he would change.
Mm-hmm.
Which probably, I'm trying to think about the merchants and the money changers. I mean, on some level, the temple was a community center. It was the one place that everybody had to go to. So it almost makes sense that you would be selling things there, because that's the nature of the beast. But it goes too far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The like, where are the limits? Where are the boundaries within which you have the freedom? And I think that's true in a lot of faith communities today, where it's how do you find the balance of people need access to these resources and we can provide them, and we need money in order to sustain a community of faith and a building and all of those things. And are we taking advantage of people?
When we reach verse 15, we read, "Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle." The he there being Jesus. And when I teach this story, I like to teach it, and it shows up in multiple Gospels, so this is not the only version of this story.
Though this is the only version where it shows up at the beginning of Jesus' ministry.
Yeah, which is pretty odd compared to the way it shows up elsewhere. And it doesn't get emphasized quite as much in this version of the story, but in other versions of the story, it's quite obvious that Jesus is full on losing his temper. And that's kind of not something that most people think about Jesus doing a lot.
Yeah. This one though, like, feels really intentional. Like, he goes there and then makes a whip of cords. Like, that has to take
that takes
time.
a while. Yeah, so he might have lost his temper, and then he thought about it for a while making the whip, and then he decided to go through with it. So that's a little different. But there's also the option of, depending on how you read it, it can also just sound like he completely lost his patience, which is totally not an option with this particular gospel reading because of making the whip, which would have taken a little while.
Mm-hmm. And, like, how many people would have, like, seen him making the whip and, like, done double takes and, like, What?
I guess I would have figured that he would have wandered off where he wasn't being watched. But of course, this is Jesus, so he always had a crowd following him, so that might have been different.
I think this was like an intentional organizing action, where it's like,
what was he
gathering
standing in front
people,
of the
like,
money
just
changers
standing
while
there making the whip,
braiding
and
the whip?
and like people were gathering around to see what was going to happen.
What's he going to do now? Yeah.
That's my theory.
But since there's a whip in the story, my mind immediately went to Indiana Jones. And it occurs to me that, sure, Jesus probably could have gone in there all patient and meek and mild, you might say, and tried to talk the merchants into leaving. But A, that probably wouldn't have worked, and B, even if it had or hadn't worked, it would have taken forever and a day. This was faster. So that reminds me of a story from the filming of the first Indiana Jones movie. There was this big sword fight scene that they had all planned out and choreographed, and Harrison Ford and the other guy whose name I don't remember had rehearsed it several times, and it was very elaborate and fairly long. And the thing is, the day that they were going to shoot the thing, Harrison Ford had a really nasty case of the flu. Or possibly a cold, or something like that. He was sick as a dog, and pretty miserable. And so they set up the first take. He is exhausted. He's sick. He's standing there in his costume, and he has no energy, but he's Harrison Ford, so he's going to try. And they start filming. The bad guy shows up, raises his sword, and Harrison Ford just kind of looks at him for a second, and then draws the gun on his hip and fires. And the other actor, thank goodness, has the presence of mind to fall down. I love that part. And the plan was to do the full-on sword fight, but of course Indiana Jones would take the short and easy route, right? Like, there is no way that Indiana Jones was going to do a full-on honorable sword fight if he could just shoot the guy. No, that's not who Indiana Jones is. And that take was actually so hilarious and true to Indiana's character that it made the movie, and I don't think they ever actually shot the big fancy sword fight. As I've heard it. So I have to wonder, did Jesus have a cold that day?
That's why he spends like hours making a whip.
It's easier to sit there making a whip than it is to go in there and argue for hours with money changers and merchants.
It's true. If I had a flu or a cold, I could probably still knit. I was thinking about verse 15, and I was thinking about So Jesus makes a whip of cords, and he drove all of them out of the temple. And then the all of them that he's talking about is both the sheep and the cattle. And so I was like, oh, it's like Babe, the pig from the movie, who like herds the sheep and like just sends them out. Possibly so that they didn't like eat the coins on accident and get sick. I don't know. But yeah, I just imagined like Babe helping Jesus like get the sheep and the cattle out of the temple.
A little bit of anger also goes a long way,
mm-hmm.
especially when people aren't accustomed to seeing it out of you.
Yeah, that's the like what would Jesus do bracelets that exist everywhere. This usually comes up whenever we're at this particular passage in the church year, but there's always like a piece of me that is like, what would Jesus do? Well, flipping tables, not always out of the option, like always a valid option to consider.
Yes.
That is part of like, I don't know, I think about the way that Midwestern white niceness happens, and like there's no room for anger, but sometimes anger is real and valid. And right, I think about the pandemic, and I'm angry about the pandemic. I'm angry about the number of people who died who didn't need to have died.
Yeah.
And that anger is important.
And sometimes anger can lead to productivity.
Mm-hmm.
Not always good productivity, but still.
You know, productivity of some sort. So, Russell.
Yes.
Any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
42 is the only possible answer to that question.
Yes, thank you. Congratulations on being our first guest to guess the correct answer.
I'm surprised that more people didn't go down that route.
To be honest, I think you're number 5.
Yeah, we haven't had a ton of guests.
But that's also fair, I suppose. I mean, the other thing I was thinking about is, we talked about the Ten Commandments in the book of Exodus. There's also a second telling in the book of Dvarim, in the book of Deuteronomy. Mm-hmm. And there are some significant differences, one of which is in the 4th commandment about the Sabbath day. In Exodus, you have remember. In Deuteronomy, you have keep. The idea of... And so in one of the songs we sing on Friday night, it goes, Shamor v'zachor bedibor echad, like, to keep and remember in one word. That both of these ideas are important. And so there are other subtle differences. I'm looking at I Googled a website so I'd have it in case it came up, and I don't want to go into too many details, but there are some significant differences that kind of give some other context to why or how, and it's just interesting that such an important piece of legislation would have two versions of some difference. Mm-hmm. I don't know how that is responded to in the Christian tradition.
I believe that the two common ways of numbering the Ten Commandments within the Christian tradition, one of them takes after Exodus and one of them takes after Deuteronomy.
Oh.
I have no idea which is which.
And I don't know enough about the Christian numbering to have an opinion, but
nobody does.
That actually reassures me somehow.
I think also for the way that I learned about the difference of Exodus and Deuteronomy is the Exodus as like the more original one, and the book of Deuteronomy coming about as part of like one of the passages where one of the kings, maybe it's King Hezekiah.
I'm not sure I'm not sure where you're going,
but they like discover this book, and there's this like renewal of faith and covenants and paying attention to the Torah. And so the Deuteronomy as a like revisiting of Exodus, and okay, what are the updates that are needed in it? What have we learned since then that like this actually, we don't need to just remember the Sabbath but also keep it, or like those sorts of things is what I was taught, at least in seminary.
I mean, Jewish they make you the argument that keeping it is one thing and remembering it is a different thing, because keeping it involves the rules.
Yeah, and it involves the action or inaction, as the case may be.
Yeah, always exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much for being with us, Russell. This has been wonderful. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the fourth Sunday of Lent. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you appreciate what we do or want to get actual transcripts of the podcast episodes, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that. Though if you want to help us with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christians said, Pax vobiscum.